Right, David, would you like to go first?
Well, I'm David Blockley. I think only John is. Do you call you John J, John, or John?
Just
Or
John.
just John?
Yeah. Or anything
Just
else.
John. I met you all except John.
Yeah, that's fine. Thank you.
I'm an emeritus professor of engineering at University of Bristol in UK, and I'm still active, although I've been retired 15 years. And I've had a journey from a traditional engineering education, in my case, civil engineering, into systems through me having some time in industry and coming into academia, realizing that there are enormous gaps between what we know, what we do, and why things go wrong. And the things going wrong were quite emotionally important to me, because one of my student colleagues worked on the box girder bridges in the 1970s, which you may remember, and a number of them collapsed. And he had a very near-death experience as he was on one of the bridges when it fell down. So it kind of impacted on me, because I could have been him if I'd chosen to go and work for a different company. And what I realized is that we have engineering science, which is going to be part of our discussion today. And we have engineering practice, which is related to engineering science, but only rather loosely in my experience, particularly on the civil side. And we have things going wrong, which are largely down to human factors and human error. And I set about trying to understand why these gaps had occurred and how to bridge them. And in that journey, I went through a whole learning experience. My mathematics was very primitive as an engineer, just done the standard course. And I came across fuzzy set theory and so on, and played around with that because it intuitively captured some of the ideas that I was playing around with. I realized I need to get some stronger philosophical grasp on uncertainty. And I needed to understand why people behaved in the way they did. And the long and short of it is I came to realize that systems was the way to improve things. And then so I struggled with a version of systems theory and systems engineering, which is somewhat idiosyncratic to me. I've managed to recruit Patrick and a number of others, but I'm not having much influence with some of the authorities in the UK who seem to think that they know what systems engineering is about, and it's not something I relate to very easily. Patrick has done a lot of work trying to build those links, and he's linked with you, Gary, through Encode and so on. And that's where we are now. So that's me, basically.
Okay.
And you were the one who suggested.
Perhaps I should say perhaps I should say what I'm hoping to get out of this meeting.
Yeah.
I understand that the basics of mathematics are quite difficult for people like we engineers. And John, you obviously in the thick of that.
Not as much as you might think. Seriously, yeah.
It's finding common language to talk about these things. So I understood relations a little bit through looking at fuzzy set theory and so on, fuzzy logic. But what I want to understand is what you're doing, John, what the papers you've written, and how they relate to the practice of engineers, who largely understand their systems through a potential that drives a flow against an impedance. So you've got gravitational fields and you've got electromagnetic fields in which forces make changes, produce changes in the things that we are looking at. So I've generalized that to answers to questions why that drive changes in people, changes in things, states of systems, that is, in certain contexts, because everything's very context dependent in my view, and through time. So I see processes as being really fundamental, and holons as processes is what I've tried to develop. So as Patrick would put it, the entanglement of cause and effect is what we're trying to sort out here, and the differences between natural systems or biological systems and mechanistic systems. And those differences are crucial when we're talking about complexity. So the purpose for me is to try and relate to what you've done doing, John, what I've read of you doing with those sorts of common engineering views or interpretations.
Okay. Sounds great.
Very, very briefly then, John, because David has said a great deal of what we have had and discussed over many years. I came at this from a different point of view altogether. When I went to college, I was absolutely mad keen about understanding how to do things in and on the sea.
In and on what?
The sea, the oceans,
Oh,
the water, the sea.
Yeah.
So when I went to it, I was incredibly lucky to get to Imperial College, but I did. You had a choice between majoring between structures or hydraulics. I chose hydraulics for the obvious reasons. And that led me to get into the design of offshore structures and to discover that actually my knowledge about flow was far more helpful than most of the simplifications used by structural engineers in the 1960s. And so I found myself actually in quite a good position to take advantage of things like computers and so on as they were just beginning to come in. And so that enabled me to get on quite rapidly into offshore oil and gas platforms. I did a bit of reservoir work, and I did a bit of, I spent a couple of years building a quay in the Seychelles, believe it or not. And then, so I went on through that life and became a director of a consulting engineering firm fairly early, and enjoyed myself immensely in dealing with all the problems we created in building structures in the North Sea and in the Pacific and so on and so forth.
What kind of structures?
Sorry?
What kind of structures?
Most of the structures I was dealing with were fixed. So, but big.
Mhm.
The largest one I've actually designed was in 600 feet of water in the North Sea, the Magnus platform. I did the concept and feasibility design for that. And then I got into repairing them because they were in need of a fair amount of repair as a result of all that. But they didn't fall down, which is interesting.
What platform was it?
The platform that Magnus was the platform I did the concept and feasibility design for.
I don't know what that is.
Magnus is about 600 feet of water. It's the most northern British platform in the North Sea. It doesn't quite go into the Norwegian sector because, of course, they join up somewhere up there. And
what does it do? What's it for?
Oh, produces oil and gas.
Yeah, so I was guessing that it was oil and gas.
Sorry, oil and gas, hydrocarbons, sinful stuff, you know.
So are these drilling platforms or what?
No, production. Well, they are drilling and production, actually. They do both. You take what in America would have been on about a 50-hectare site and put it onto about an acre or half a hectare site and stick it up in some of the most inclement environmental conditions you could possibly imagine, and then produce some of the largest quantities of oil and gas that are produced out of any fields. It was exciting stuff. However, into the 80s, my company I was director of, consulting engineering companies, mainly in ordinary civil engineering, and for the ups and downs of the oil industry, we wanted to expand, hadn't got the cash to expand, even though we're a very large company by normal standards. So the director said, can you take us out of oil and gas, but keep BP as a client, which I did. And then they said, well, now can you transfer the technology you've got from oil and gas and transfer it into things like big bridges and I found myself into things like risk. Well, I'd already got into risk actually, and value management and all those type of stuff. And one day I gave a paper to a conference of health and safety conference in UK in 1994. And David came up to me afterwards and said, oh, Patrick, you're the first practicing engineer I've ever met who has come to the same conclusions as we have.
Ah.
Did you know that there's 25 years of solid research behind what you said? Whereupon I said, wow. And you then said, do you want to be a professor or a visiting professor, actually? So I said, what does that mean?
I didn't say that, Patrick.
You did.
Not until a lot later when I knew you better.
Well, anyway, it makes a good story, whatever we say. So I ended up by being asked to be a visiting professor in about 1994. And as a result, later on, I got asked to be a proper professor, but that was after I'd retired. So I went in retirement and took on 10 years of running the system centre at Bristol. And that's where I got to know about Incosi, discovered that they were on a sort of parallel but practical path. And
it's amazing.
What?
It's amazing, isn't it, when practice actually agrees with theory? That's quite rare, in fact.
It is, yeah. Well, it's not as rare as it could be closer if people were a little bit more transdisciplinary in their thinking.
If they had a decent theory too.
Could help. Anyway, cutting that out, let's come back to where we are at the moment. David has put the case very, very clearly to me. I haven't got David's understanding of mathematics. Even though it was actually mathematics that got me into engineering when I was a student. The reason is that mathematics seems to have changed in terms of its language enormously since I went to college. even though the principles seem to be not that different as far as I can see. So I can usually understand what mathematicians are getting at if I listen hard enough and have helpful people like David around. But I don't see myself as being a mathematician. If I put it very bluntly, I got through college because I realized there are only about 7, I think it is, differential equations, and that they were very useful for practical purposes, but I didn't ever learn how to derive any of them. I only learned how to look up how you could work out the answers from them, which was just a practical approach to that.
Probably why you're able to get something done.
maybe not. I don't know. But anyway, I enjoyed it. That's the main thing. And I must say, I also enjoyed the dialogue that you started with, or David. Well, start of all, David asked the questions, and your answers I found very, very helpful, I might say.
Oh, good.
It was about 3 o'clock this morning. I read them because I sometimes get up in the night to think about things, and I was going to prepare for this meeting. I read it with real interest, and my note about it was genuine. So I'm going to, at that point, hand over and enjoy the dialogue between you. And I promise that if I have some idea, even though it may be stupid, I'll put it in, and I will not be at all worried if you told me my idea is stupid.
Well,
out of some stupid ideas, some brilliant ones have emerged from time to time.
I try to focus on the stupid ones, actually, because those are the ones that get me somewhere.
Okay, over to you. Over to Gary, actually.
So do you want me to respond a little bit, Gary, or what do you want to do now?
Yeah, go ahead. I mean, all I want to do through this is to help identify some synergies and get you guys working together, because I think there's an awful lot of potential. So that's what I'm hoping for.
Well, I tried to take notes as you were both talking, and and the thing that came up, maybe I'll start mentioning something about, was the mathematics, because that seems to be a discomfort that everybody has, and including myself. Yesterday, I was in a conversation with Philip Boxer, Kent Palmer, and David Kiersey was supposed to be there, but he couldn't for personal reasons. And they are interested in something called requisite agility, which is sort of the next level above requisite variety. It's the ability of a system to respond to unpredictable circumstances and things like that. So they got interested in the relational theory and the hold-on theory, and we've been having a series of discussions about it. Well, these guys, they're going off, they're talking about quaternions and octonions and Lie algebras, and I sat there and listened for 2 hours, and I felt like the biggest dunce in the world because I didn't have a clue what they were talking about. And I eventually told them, I don't know what you guys are talking about. I'm sure it's interesting, but I don't know why you need me. So I went away, feeling a little bit sheepish about that, and wondering, okay, what is the story here? Now, if Judith Rosen were here, who I worked with quite a bit, she was Robert Rosen's daughter. And the reason I worked with Judith was because first of all, she was very close to her dad, and she followed his work a lot and understood it. She's not a scientist and she's not a mathematician. She doesn't like the math. But she says that he told her repeatedly that you don't need the math to understand relational theory. And so it's all there I wrote it in prose, and then I added the math for the people who want to criticize it. And that's kind of the approach I've taken too. Category theory is the basis of the relational framework. And the neat thing about category theory is it has two languages. You know, one is algebra with all the symbols and weird stuff, and the other is graph. You know, the vector diagrams, the arrows and boxes. And I personally feel that I was able to achieve something with the relational hold-on because I worked with the graph and I didn't work with the algebra. If you go to Aloysius Louis, and he was a student of Rosen's, and he's continued work, and he's written a number of books on functional entailment, which I came up with in the hold-on. And then later at a workshop in South Africa, we figured out that that was the same thing. But his books, I mean, there's probably 3 people on the planet who can read them, right? Because it's just all this category theory algebra. Maybe there's more than that. I just not in that group, you know. So I tend to focus on the concepts on a more intuitive level. And for me, the visual graphs are the things that I can understand and think about. And then I think that the math is necessary when you want to prove it, when you want to check it out and say, okay, have I just gone off into some fantasy world, or is this going to work? So we have had some intensive discussions with a logician. I guess she's a mathematician, and it centers on one critical issue in logic that would relate to the hold-on and similar theories. It's a consciousness discussion group that I've been in for 2 years, and just took a break from so that I could do things like this and get some papers done. But the issue that came up there is very simply, if you think of the hold-on as being 2 categories that are related, and does that make sense to everybody from what you've seen so far? Yeah, I mean, there's 2 hemispheres, right? There's a left and a right, or a top and a bottom. I draw it top bottom now, and then there's a connection between them. Well, inside the category, there's causality. There's entailments of causes. So you have, a chain of logic where something precedes something else and is responsible for the outcome. But between the categories, there is no such causality. There's no such logic that anybody can come up with. So one of the theories in the consciousness discussion group is called interdependent dual aspect monism. And it looks a lot like the hold-on. And at first I was very excited that, that you're going down the right track. But the one thing that he did that was, I think, fatal was if you go down to an analysis, analytical level, and you want to write an equation, you have variables, and the variables have states, right? So he said that not only are the categories necessary in a system, which I believe they are, so it's fair to say that the categories are inseparable and necessary in every system. And that's what the hold-on says. But then he said that each individual state of the system, of the whole system, was a dual aspect state. So you had a physical state, and then you had like a mental state. And he wanted to connect those in a one-to-one relationship. So this is now where a mathematical discussion got started, because Kathy Reason came in and said, that won't work. If you do that, I can prove mathematically that the system will reduce to a mechanism. Now, I said the same thing based on Rosen's thinking, because he pretty much looked at what causes a mechanism, and how you get, and what is more than a mechanism. That was his whole thesis with the MR system. So anyway, so that's, I wanted to give some of that information because I think it's useful to understand the holon, but also I think it's useful to understand the role of mathematics. It's when you get into a paradox like that. Now we're going to go into all of the mathematical and logistical theories and concepts to see, well, is it excluded or isn't, or is there a workaround? But as a scientist, I'm only marginally interested in the mathematics says it's right or not, because we do a lot of things that mathematics can't prove, and I think engineers do too. So it's an interest, you know. It's like, oh, there's a mathematical inconsistency there. I don't know if that is a fatal flaw for the theory, or if it means we need more mathematics, you know, because mathematics is being invented all the time, and category theory is relatively new. So I look at it as mathematics as a way of modeling what we're doing, and really, actually, we can model it conceptually, use some minimal logic to make sure that the concepts aren't contradictory, and then we get into some tricky mathematics if there's an issue to resolve that looks difficult or challenging. Anyway, I don't know if all that was useful or not, but your comments made me think of it, and the experience I had yesterday, which I was glad to get out of.
I think that's useful. I've got one or two comments. Is Gary going to go next?
It's up to you guys.
I don't really think I need to say anything. I just want to listen. I mean, what I've tried to do with John, and also to take into account other people's work, like Bill Smith, for instance, is I've been trying to create a really simple representation of the holon theory. I think one thing I will say is when I first encountered this, I think it was actually at the Washington ISSS conference when you gave the talk, John. And when I saw what you presented, it really hit me. I thought, wow, this is something that can actually underpin our life cycle management in terms of our engineering.
Yeah.
And that was the first glimpse I had of something from system science, which could actually underpin our systems engineering processes. And that's, for me, that had a big impact. And I'm very, very grateful that I had the opportunity to sit in on that. So yeah, that's all I'm going to say.
Well, yeah, and I'm very grateful that you picked up on it, because there aren't very many people who are. I think it's growing a little bit, and I'm getting more and more questions and proposals to collaborate and things like that. And that's encouraging. But it's not going to go very much farther with me for a lot of reasons. And it's really important that other people pick up on it and apply their ideas. You know, the difficulty with that, of course, is that whenever someone else inherits something like this or picks it up, anybody's work, it could go in different directions. So one of the things that I did early on was I realized that I missed the opportunity to meet Robert Rosen, and it turns out that he would have been very happy to meet me at the time, but one of his students told me otherwise and said he was sick and the family didn't want any visitors and I should stay away. So I did, and it wasn't until 2 or 3 years later when I met Judith that she said, no, that wasn't the case at all. He would have loved it if you'd come. because I had invited him to a conference at ISSS in California at Asilomar. It was the 1999 conference. It was pretty much when I got started with ISSS. And I wanted him to meet Roger Penrose. And it turns out Penrose was interested, but he said it would be better if Stuart Hameroff went instead of him. And so Stuart came. But unfortunately, Robert Rosen passed away in 88, right before the conference. And then this student of his, Don Michalecki, came instead. And he was the one who had kept me away from the family. And he wasn't at all into talking with Hameroff. He thought he was crazy. And he was rather arrogant and had his own idea of what Rosen was doing, which later I decided wasn't quite what Rosen was doing. So things got a little weird, but we did have the plenary, and Stuart Hameroff did speak, and it was interesting to a lot of folks. But anyway, that's a sidetrack, sorry. I guess I wanted to say something about engineering. I'm a bit of an engineer also, even though I went into physics and then later switched to ecology, and then that turned into system science. And on a personal level, a very strong spiritual interest as well. So I also want to integrate it East and West science and spirituality. I don't think the integration stops at any comfortable boundary when it comes to social science and these questions of ourselves and who we are and spirit. So I don't draw a line there. I don't get worried about that. But on the engineering side, my father was a steam engineer, and he pretty much taught himself after high school, which he didn't finish. I think he did. He finished high school, but he didn't go on beyond that. He joined the Navy, worked his way up to chief engineer, and then he worked in the Merchant Marine as chief engineer on a lot of ships. And we grew up, with building all kinds of things and doing all sorts of engineering projects and stuff. So I have that practical side, and I went, I was on ships too. So I was in the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. So I know a little bit about the sea. And then I was on an oil spill research team. So, I know a little bit about oil platforms and particularly accidental oil spills, because we were basically spill chasers. We were looking at oil spills around the world to see what happened, to study what happens to oil when it's in the marine environment. And that was probably the most exciting period of my life, because it was just really life in the fast lane. We were on the Amico Cadiz spill in France, which was unbelievable. And one of the things I learned from that, which I'm looking at retrospectively now from the perspective of holon theory, is crisis science. There was a paper written. I don't know if I've got it on my bookshelf here, but it's more than a paper. It was a report. Science under uncertainty. It says crisis science under uncertainty. Is the idea of doing science during a crisis, and that's what we were doing. We were a ragtag team, threw together experiments and practiced off the Santa Barbara coast in oil spills or oil slicks, because there's natural seepage there. And then when we heard on the radio or from any source that there was a tanker accident in an oil spill, we'd send one or two people out to check it out and see if it had research potential. And if it did, we'd activate the team. And it's kind of like a SWAT team, We get out there and we'd start doing scientific experiments. And because I had made the switch from geophysics to ecology just prior to joining the team, I was asked to put together a biological set of experiments, and because they had a physical component, and then they added a chemical component. And now they said, well, what can we do about the biological? And that's hugely challenging because with the physics and the chemistry, you have some general laws that you can rely on. But with the biology, the laws are a little fuzzy. And also you really need prior conditions to do anything. And how are you going to get prior conditions in an accidental oil spill at random locations around the world? Well, it turned out that one tanker went aground in the Baltic Sea. It was a Russian tanker, and it went aground right in the middle of the University of Stockholm's marine biology study area. So they had all the historical data. So I got lucky in that sense, and 1 year study of the sea oil spill, and that worked out fairly well. Anyway, so I just wanted, so if you have some idea of the background I have, I can understand where you're coming from.
Well, that's, if I can make a few comments then. You're a scientist with a bit of engineering, as you've just told us, and I'm an engineer with a bit of philosophy and a bit of maths, perhaps in a similar way. And one of the first sources of philosophical reading that I undertook was Karl Popper. I don't know if you have read him much, but
yeah, I cited him in my PhD dissertation.
Yeah, I found one set of concepts is incredibly helpful, and that is his idea of three worlds. The world one of reality. I noticed in your reply to my note that you say that you can only access that reality through models. So I think that's the first point of agreement, because a lot of people think that they are seeing the reality rather than our perception and shared understanding of that reality. So world two is, as you know, our own individual ideas about what we're talking about, our own understanding, which is quite difficult to share, but we do share it, and we do it through science and through all the knowledge that we have in world three, which is what Popper called objective. Now, to most engineers, objective means measurable, whereas in the sense of world three, Popper, objective means outside of the individual. So if we say that animal is a unicorn, or that Sherlock Holmes is a real person, that is
not
false. False in it's a world three statement because Sherlock Holmes doesn't exist, but he's not a real person. So you could make true and false statements in world three, and I think that was one of the first things it's important to understand. So, John, do you see that those three worlds as being useful?
Well, of course, yeah. I mean, I think most of the problem that we've had in the consciousness discussion group for 2 years, and the reason I decided to bail out of it for a while, is that it just devolved into a disagreement between whether they're talking about world one or world three.
Yeah, exactly.
And
I find that in that's the most difficult part of the discussion with most engineers, certainly in my experience in the UK here and worldwide. But
I would say that's the first
go
ahead, sorry.
That clarity is important, I think, to inform the rest of our thinking. The second piece of work that I came across was, of course, Koestler's book on where he introduced the idea of a holon. I hadn't realized that there was a history behind it, because he presented it as his idea. I think the word holon perhaps hadn't been coined, but the idea was around a long time before that, and in particular in South Africa. Can't remember the name of the chap, but he was a general, wasn't he? You probably know.
Smuts.
Much, yeah.
Yeah. And I find that incredibly powerful, intuitively, not mathematically, but intuitively. Is that what you were thinking, Gary, when you reacted to John's lecture? Were you seeing the holon as an intuitive, important concept rather than what the mathematics behind it might be?
Yeah, so what stood out for me was essentially the phases of the system experience. Yeah.
Yes.
And relating that to the phases of engineering, so the conceptualization, appreciating chaos, well, starting to see potential systems in chaos, and then moving into the architecture space where you're starting to organize systems and their relationships, and then moving into the design space where you're putting in place the influences necessary to bring about the implementation, and then the realization. So I could see classically kind of the solution concept review at one intersection, the PDR, the CDR, and the acceptance review, essentially. So that's what I saw when I first saw John's presentation.
So I'm interpreting that as a kind of engineering intuitive understanding of an idea, which could be very important because it captures levels of abstraction, first of all, and secondly, it deals with the problem of dimensionality, because if you think about everything, then it's enormously challenging because of all the different dimensions that one has to consider.
Right.
And by layering, by having the hierarchy of holons, which you freely call a holarchy, John, I've sort of kept off it, because that word holarchy, because people here and that I've talked to dislike the word holon. They see it as a jargon term. They don't seem to be able to get hold of the intuitive idea that Gary's got hold of, and Patrick. But a lot of engineers find that difficult. And I really don't know why that is, because it seems so intuitively important.
Well, I didn't have another word for it. And I didn't really know Kessler before working on this. So the theory really came out of Rosen's work. And then once I decided to call it a holon, of course, I did a Google search to see if what other people said about holons and if it was already in use and that sort of thing. And then I realized, oh yeah, I had probably remembered the term from some vague reference to Kessler. And so I got some of his books and looked at those and said, well, I would be intellectually dishonest if I didn't call it a holon, because he pretty much nailed it on a descriptive level without having the mathematics. And he pretty much said what it was. And I try to be a stickler for giving credit to prior authors all the way back to the Vedic civilization. When I discovered that there was a strong similarity to ideas that existed 4,000 years ago in the Indus Valley. Well, they deserve credit too, so I'll cite them, even though it might not be culturally popular to do that. But I don't know of a better word for it.
I just think we've got to get over the hurdle of people reacting badly to the word. I mean, I guess the more we use it and the more foundation that you are giving, we give to it, the more intellectually respectable it will become. People will start to accept it more. I
hope
think
so.
because it's intuitive and people don't necessarily see things the same way intuitively, they reject it because it sounds like a jargon term, management speak. Is
It
what
sounds-
somebody said to me.
Management speak, yeah. I think another impression could be that it's kind of new agey.
Yeah, exactly. So,
But then the other term you could use that I've discovered in this consciousness group is dual aspect monism.
say it again.
Dual aspect monism. So it's the idea
Oh.
of a monad, and now that doesn't sounds jargony too. I think it conjures up a lot of philosophical, baggage or depth or whatever you want to call it. But a dual aspect monad, that's what it is. It's a dual aspect monad. And there's a whole, literature on monads. But then you get into all these, and this is where we got bogged down in the consciousness group, is that you get into all these isms, so somebody said something 50 years ago and somebody else didn't quite understand it, but they sort of put a boundary on it and called it an ism, so this is Kantism, this is
Exactly, yeah.
monism, this
That's
is
right.
and I said, forget the isms, they're retrospective, it's just a categorization, they're not going to get us anywhere to talk in isms.
Well, I came to hate the word isms when I had some discussions with a very eminent philosopher here in Bristol, who unfortunately has passed on now, Stephen Kerner. He wrote a book on categorical frameworks based on Kant. And actually, he was my external examiner for my Doctor of Science degree here, because nobody else would examine it.
Yeah. I think the one ism we did focus on was mechanism. Well, because that's an ism, right?
It is, yes.
But
well, he used to say, oh, when you say something, he said, oh, you're assuming some ism or other. And I began to say, no, I don't know whether I am or not, because along with that ism came all sorts of other assumptions, which I didn't know whether I'd made them or not. Right. So I avoid isms as far as
except
possible.
now everybody, like you were just laughing, mechanism becomes part of our language and we don't think of it in the same way as idealism.
No, we don't. That's true.
Dualism and idealism and all those other philosophical isms, but then we have mechanism, and it's just absolutely just as much of an ism as anything else.
Yeah. I mean, the next thing that
can I just step in for a moment here?
Yeah.
I've seen exactly the same problem of acceptance and lived through much similar stuff to David, because I worked at Bristol for a fair amount of the time. I came to a very clear conclusion that one had to keep using the word which fitted, made sense with everything else we're talking about. And that's why holism and holons, right, fit. I've tried to find a better word from holistic and holon. I haven't, and that's over about 20 years now. What I have discovered is the world is coming towards us. And that, if I've understood, was it Kuhn, isn't it? If I've understood Kuhn properly, that's a sign that we're on the right track for communications.
Well, in fact, that was exactly the next point I was going to make, that I then came across Thomas Kuhn's work, and it changed my view of science and its relationship with engineering totally.
Yeah, me too.
The relationship with social sciences as well. So yes, we realize that we are on we're in a scientific revolution, I think, in the sense of Kuhn, and we're having a paradigm shift, but it's taking a lot longer than I thought it would.
Right,
But I
because
guess
we've been
that's always
talking
the
about
case.
we've been talking about paradigm shifts since the beginning of my career, so it's like a lifetime
Yeah,
process. You know, of course, Popper and Kuhn ended up agreeing on a very important point there. Kuhn had the idea of revolutions, and Popper, and toward the end of his career, accepted that there was part of science was a metaphysical research program. He called it an MRP because he was thinking about evolution. Strange, you know, it's a little bit tautological, and people were saying, well, is that really scientific? And he was saying, well, it's a metaphysical research program is what it is. And he recognized that as part of science. And
well,
yeah.
Yeah, I didn't see the conflict between Popper and Kuhn that most philosophers seem to see. I
didn't
thought
either.
they were talking about the same language, but perhaps slightly differently.
I think in the early part of Popper's career, I think he was a little more hard nosed, but it was later that he accepted the MRP.
Yeah, but he was all about evolution of ideas, wasn't he? And conjectures and refutations and so on. So a lot of people concentrate on the falsification bit rather than the other ideas of evolutionary change. But that leads me to the next point, which is that people talk in terms of objects. But I began to see that objects really we should discuss in terms of being of change, of process. And again, most people react against that. I had somebody just, another engineer, very eminent engineer in the UK, tell me that when you say that you, a person, is a whole-on and an object, a process, you're just plain wrong. A jet engine is an object, it's not a process. I said, yes, it is. It's changing.
They're saying that an object is not a process? Yeah.
He was saying that. I'm saying it is.
Mm-hmm.
And people react against that idea as well. But I just wondered how you saw that. And do you see things as changing processes?
Have you run into much of Whitehead's work?
Who, sorry?
Whitehead, Alfred North Whitehead. I haven't heard that one.
I'm not catching the
Alfred
name.
North, Alfred North Whitehead.
Oh, yes.
Okay, yeah. So, and there's a group in California at Claremont College on process, theory, and it's very, very. We had a conference out there, and I presented the whole-on. We discussed it at some extent, and you could definitely look at the whole-on as the same as process theory, Whitehead's process theory. It depends on what you mean by process. People have their own parochial definitions, but certainly if there's a cyclical causality, which is another way of describing the whole-on, if you don't want to use the word, just talk about cyclical causality. Or a closed loop of causation. Another term that's coming into use now is just loop causality. So it's all of that, and certainly it's a process model.
Well, we're trying to shift people's view away from a process as being a simple transformation. Mm-hmm. So you've got a box with an in transformation and an out. That's
because they're only thinking of one type of process. So
exactly,
yeah. If you go, so you can, a mental process is also a process, but it's going to be hard to put it in mechanical terms.
So you know, that was why I came up with the idea of why and how and who, where and when as being the variables. And in a sense, we can deal in a common sense engineering type way with all the complex relationships between people and their circumstances, and between things and their circumstances, and the contextual assumptions that we make about the way a mechanical system or mechanism works. Because we, you know, as engineers, we know we're making all sorts of approximations all the way along the line. And it's these that contribute to the uncertainties. Yeah. So in a sense that that formulation is very, very general. It's not really a mathematical form. It's an abstraction of a set of ideas and their relationship. But the central question then really to most engineers is how to model uncertainty. And I think that's where your work and our work can help, perhaps, because you know, you are very aware that many mathematicians see uncertainty entirely in terms of probability theory. And I had difficulty right from the beginning with probability theory because of the issue of incompleteness and the known unknowns and the unknown unknowns. And I realized the importance of those when I looked at the Boxford bridges that I mentioned at the beginning, and many, many other accidents that have occurred, disasters that have occurred, where things have come to the fore that were not previously appreciated. Either they were known about but not seen as important, or they just weren't known about at all. And it goes a lot, way, way back. And I just quote you a historical instance of the collapse of the Dee Bridge, which you may not know about, in 1849, I think it was, which was due to lateral torsional buckling, that is the instability of a beam in a bridge, which was a phenomena not known about in 1848 or 49, whenever it was. So there's an inquiry into why the bridge collapsed, and it had all sorts of explanations other than the one that we would give nowadays. Because we have now analyzed that bridge, so we know all the details about it, and concluded it was laterally torsionally unstable. And the reason it occurred is because the design was based on a rule which was formulated in a quite a different context 50 years earlier. And that rule had been used successfully to design similar bridges until this one, because what happened was we moved beyond the threshold and it brought about a different kind of behavior. And it wasn't until 30 years later that we understood what lateral torsional buckling is. So there you've got a good example. There's many, 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 many more of phenomena which you only either partially understand or don't understand at all. And these can become critical. And the only way to deal with that, it seems to me, is to try and anticipate as many unintended consequences as one can when designing, but at the same time to design your system so that they fail safe if they do fail, and that we're alert to signs that things are going awry in some way. In other words, we're pushing things to the limit. That's another strand to our thinking here, that I worked with a social scientist called Barry Turner, who unfortunately died very young, but he had this idea that failure incubates. And he got that idea from studying a number of disasters, such as the one in Wales that where the coal tip Aberfan. I don't know if you know about Aberfan, John, but it's a coal tip that collapsed onto a school and killed lots of children. And
when you were talking about bridges collapsing, the one that came to my mind was the Hood Canal Bridge, because if they didn't take into account harmonics, you know, and the length of the bridge.
Yeah, I've written a lot about these case histories, and there is a pattern, and you can spot what Barry Turner calls incubating set of conditions, but not always. So we're not infallible. We know that accidents will continue to happen, and we have to try and educate people to understand that's inevitable, but whilst at the same time reducing the chances of something happening that we haven't anticipated. But of course, climate change is the biggest example of all of how we're spotting patterns of change. And we're having difficulty persuading people in power to do things that they need to do in order to ameliorate the symptoms. So to me, the biggest contribution we could make is to try and understand uncertainty better, and to see it in the context of resilient systems, that are systems that where they fail safe, or where we can continually steer them towards success. So we're constantly monitoring what's going on, as you do, Gary, in an aeroplane already. On the civil side, we don't do that because it costs too much, they say. But in space aircraft and in ordinary aircraft, you're constantly monitoring and checking the condition of the engine to make sure that cracks don't form and so on. Well, they do form inevitably, but they don't become overly serious before we can replace components and so on. So somehow we've got to coerce people away from probability theory only. And that's why I got into fuzzy sets, because it seemed to me an alternative. And it is one that
you got into what? I'm sorry, I missed that.
Fuzzy sets and fuzzy logic.
Oh, fuzzy sets, yeah, right.
Yeah, we got into that because it admits that there is a third way.
Isn't fuzzy logic still statistical? Isn't it still probabilistic?
Well,
mostly Bayesian?
It has a fundamentally different axiom, which allows you to have an incompleteness. The law of the excluded middle doesn't apply. That's what attracted me. And so I rapidly began to realize, having looked at the way, a near colleague of yours in California, Bizarre, I don't know if you ever met him, but he was the initiator of fuzzy logic.
Bizarre?
And I did actually meet him once.
John's just asking for you to repeat the name of that guy.
Sorry?
John's just asking you to repeat the name of that guy.
Bizarre.
Can you spell it?
Z-A-D-E-H.
Okay.
He understood these things intuitively. basically is an engineer, but he got into computing and information sciences. But he thought like an engineer. And
What would you say? What would you say was the fundamental axiom that you said is a fundamentally different axiom?
the
you-
law
is that-
of the excluded middle did not apply.
That's
So-
what does apply? What's the axiom that it's based on?
Well, the two, I've written a long paper about the axioms, which I can send you a copy of.
Yeah, I'd like to see that because in the consciousness group, I was trying to get across the whole on idea and people just couldn't get it. And I said, well, look, okay, let's make it simpler to understand. And instead of arguing about the logic of connecting these two hemispheres, let's just say that the connection is fuzzy, and then we don't have to worry about whether there's some proof that excludes the possibility of them being linked, because they are linked. We know that in practice, but we don't know how. So let's just call it fuzzy. And I realize that there is a whole theory of fuzzy logic, but my impression of it was that it was a little bit more flexible.
Well, your purist mathematician friends will object to fuzzy logic because basically it assumes that the indicator function of standard set theory is not simply 0 or 1, but ranges over the interval 0, 1, and is therefore a real number. Now, in the foundations of mathematics, that is something that people object to. I'm not fully sure, and I don't fully understand why, but it's something to do with the definition of what we mean by a number. So they don't like that. They will admit 3-valued logic. They would even admit some multi-valued logic, but fuzzy logic doesn't attract people because of that difficulty. Now, in my view, as a result of the paper that I just said I'd send, I came to the conclusion as an engineer, I'm not interested in that, but I needed to be able to capture the incompleteness. So we've started to use interval probabilities. That is, with a probability with a lower and upper bound, which allows you to assess evidence in favor of some statement and evidence against some statement. Now, here again, there is an important idea that I'd be interested in your view on, which is the concept of truth. Now, I decided that that wasn't a very useful concept because it's so difficult to pin down. So I coined the term dependability, because as an engineer, what we're interested in is evidence that we can use in order to make a decision. So if something is true, it's certainly dependable, but it may be dependable without being true. In other words, we know Newton's laws aren't true in the absolute sense of the whole universe. Otherwise, we wouldn't have modern physics and relativity, etc. But within the context of me building a bridge in the Bristol to cross a river, Newton's laws are fine. They are good enough. So I could consider them dependable without them being true. So that sort of avoids some of the philosophical difficulties with truth.
Perhaps, yeah.
But again, people that don't like it, because the idea of a truth is so basic to our language and our understanding the world that we can't give it up. But
Well,
I
I do
think
have some thoughts on
truth
that.
is such a tricky concept that we
Yeah.
can't really deal with it. But what we can deal with is dependable evidence. So I use an interval probability theory to assess dependable evidence.
Well, that makes sense. I mean, I do have a perspective on it. You said you were curious how I view that. Yes.
Sorry?
No, you said earlier, you said you wanted to ask me what my perspective on that is.
Yes.
Okay. So yeah, I think that makes sense to me, that dependability is one way to translate a vague concept into something more operational. If I were to off the top of my head come up with a translation, I wouldn't necessarily go to dependability, although I realize that has a lot of practical value in engineering. I would go to congruence as an understanding of truth. Now that has a history too, because I think in the earlier use of the word true, a lot of it was defined quite a bit in the sense of carpentry. And true means that you're going to true up an edge. You know, this edge is true to that edge, and so when you plane the edge and you get them to match, you call it true because it matches. And that's my sense of how to think of truth, is that it's a congruence between one thing that you're looking at and something else that is perhaps greater. So like your straight edge is a more reliable or a more important standard than the unstraight edge that you're working with. So you're going to true it up to what's better. And so there is this concept that truth is better. The truth is getting us to a greater reality than the one we're working with. And the idea of congruence, I think, also forces you to say, well, congruent with what? And see, now the holon is a template for systems. And if it holds up, it's a template for all systems, and including the universe. And you could even take it up to theological levels. So in a sense, it's a template for checking it. Once you consider the other term you weren't too happy with was holarchy. But the holarchy is what it's true to. It's what it's congruent with. It's congruent with larger systems that are also whole systems. And that's the other way to avoid the word holon, is just talk about whole systems or wholeness. So I look at it that way. I look at it as it's a congruency. And so, and I've thought also about civilizations and cultural issues, because part of the holon work is looking at sustainability. What makes the holon, you're saying, dependable. So if you had a whole system that balanced the causes in the holon, it would be a self-sustaining system, which organisms are. So it's also a picture of organisms, and they're self-sustaining systems. So it gets us to a definition of sustainability that hasn't existed anywhere in ecology before, because we've always used the term sustainability in the sense of some political or policy agenda, like it's good to save water and that'll help us be more sustainable. Are you sure that will make us more sustainable? What is it in a system sense that will do that? So the sustainability of the system is part of the holon structure, but then we have to say, well, sustainability isn't necessarily good. Sudan has been at war for 1,000 years. There's something sustainable about that whole cycle. So now you have to say, okay, well, it's sustainable, but do we want it? You know, maybe we want to disrupt it. Maybe we want to intervene and destroy it. So what makes it good or bad is going to be its congruence with some greater system. So is the war culture that's keeping Sudan locked in these battles, is, first of all, is it congruent with their own best interest? Is it congruent with the world's best interest? You know, if we start asking those questions and building out to larger systems and seeing how it affects other systems, you know, we might be able to say, well, this is probably something that isn't very sustainable or helpful in a larger picture. And, you know, and then we'll see that what is sustaining it is not its own internal processes so much as an external economy and war mentality that's sort of keeping it locked in its cycle. And then it's echoing those external harmonics, if you want to call it that, in its own internal cycles that keep it going. Anyway, so that's kind of getting a little bit off thing. I wanted to comment.
Yeah, I think that I'll need to think about congruency and dependability a bit more. But it seemed to me you were introducing, usefully introducing, importantly introducing the value system into the concept of dependability. So in other words, dependability for what?
Exactly.
For what purpose? And the driving idea behind everything that we do is purpose. So, and purpose requires a value system. So I also give a lot of emphasis to the concept of responsibility, because as engineers, we take responsibility for the things we do. And I guess this applies right across the spectrum when a doctor makes a diagnosis or when a politician makes a policy decision. They take responsibility, which they either carry through or in the case of politicians, don't. And they should be accountable for that. So responsibility and accountability are incredibly important. Now, Rolls-Royce will, Gary, be taken to account if an aeroplane crashes and it turns out to be the engine. So you take an enormous responsibility without really being given a lot of credit for it. And that's one of my beefs about the lack of understanding of what engineers do in the world. But medics, of course, take that same responsibility in diagnosing and treating people. And people recognize that because they understand it's difficult and a tricky thing to do. And there are lots of uncertainties, but somehow we have to escalate this into the people and the responsibilities and the value systems that they hold.
Yeah.
But in the end, it's the evidence that we have in order to help us make a decision to design something or maintain something to a purpose. And your work, John, can help us understand the uncertainty behind the categories of uncertainty that we have to get to grips with.
Yeah, well,
to
let's go there.
understand.
Let's just jump to that because I had something to say about the uncertainty. I mean, as far as truth goes, so just to wrap that up, I do like the term and I do use it, and I think that we have to bring it back. Right now, we're in an era that, you know, in 2016 was declared to be post-truth, right? By the Oxford English Dictionary. they come up with a phrase to characterize the culture of the world each year. And in 2016, they said we have entered into an era of post-truth, where we're going to question all truths and we're not going to really believe that there is one. Well, I think that's a horrible disease. But you're right. We have to put it into practical terms. But the thing is, if you translate it into dependability and responsibility, that's wonderful. Those are all aspects of it. But I like, the idea that we're trying to bring in the value system, because I can build something that's very dependable. I can be responsible for it. And I can do that with entirely selfish motives. And I can feel incredibly worried and nervous about it the whole time, because it depending on what value system I have. But if I'm looking at the congruence with the greater whole, and so I'm equating holism with truth. Once it expands out to the universe, once if you go far enough, it becomes more true. If it's just a small system and it's congruent with another person who also wants to create a war, well, we have a sustainable war, and it's true within that system. It's congruent within that system, but it's not true in a larger system. So that's kind of where I'm going with that, and it gets us to a value system that I can be comfortable with, that I can say, all right, the value I'm pursuing is greater than me or the system I'm creating. And so I'm, in the Eastern concept, I'm doing my dharma. I'm doing the right action for the right reason. And then it becomes dependable, becomes responsible for a purpose, like you were saying, that is a greater purpose. Anyway, so that's just
I'm conscious that Gary sent a message saying that he's got to go at 4:30. I guess we should finish then. But,
let me say something about uncertainty then, because that seems to be the key right now. I think what the relational theory does is it replaces uncertainty with a term that Rosen uses. It's impredicativity. And that means that the system, the dynamics of the system is not predicated on its previous states. There's something intervening that is, so if it's predicated on its previous states, you have a mechanism, right? So we have all the initial conditions, we have the deterministic laws, and then we have the result. Well, what if it's predicated on that, but there's something we don't know about that's also part of the initial conditions, and that's going to give us a different result? Well, now we have what became called uncertainty. But uncertainty was just a way of saying we have a mechanism that has exceptions to it that we don't understand. We're going to call those uncertainty. But impredicativity says it's not predicated entirely on this system. What is it predicated on? It's predicated on the system we're thinking about and contextual influences. Well, now, instead of a negative, not predictable, we're going to a positive, saying it's formal cause. It's another type of cause that is a downward causation from the larger system to the system we're working with. And if we think that way, we're going to be looking for the reasons for the uncertainty. We're not just going to be, and I'm with you, I don't like probability theory at all. One useful way to go there, of course, we're stuck with it, right? Because we don't have a lot of other tools. And I want to look into the fuzzy sets and the fuzzy logic. But one way to think of it, another distinction Rosen made was between modeling and simulation. So when we get to the contextual causes, the final and formal causation of the whole on, we don't know what the math is for that. And so traditional science just called it uncertainty and just gave it an error value. We've quantified what we don't know. And I think of probability as a quantification of ignorance. But one way to help put it in the right frame of thought is to say, okay, we can model things when we have an idea of what the processes are and how the processes work, and we have some mathematical tools to represent those processes. Then my model is actually doing what I think nature is doing. But when we look at uncertainty and probability, we're not modeling anything. That's
No,
a
I agree.
simulation.
I agree.
That's a
Yeah.
simulation.
There's a lot to talk about following this on the details of formal, efficient, material, causes, etc. So we can get in the detail, but I think we've understood where we're coming from a lot better, haven't we?
Yeah.
Gary wants to finish at 4:30, which is now. So maybe we can rely on him to set up another meeting, and we can have a go at the detail of how we interpret these different 4 quadrants.
Yeah.
Good. Yeah.
Very happy to do that. And this has been recorded, so I'll send that round. And if people want to exchange via email afterwards with any other ideas that come to mind, then please do so. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. But
This is very interesting to me. I want to thank you for setting it up, because I feel like with this conversation, we can focus on something where we can make progress.
Yes.
Thank you, Gary, and thank you, John.
No, thank you.
Can
Thanks,
I
everybody.
just put one hopefully very encouraging remark into this? I think what we're heading, and people know I'm over optimistic maybe, but maybe you have to be in these circumstances. I think that what we're heading towards is something which will make a real difference for the world, not only at the climate change issue, but right the way down to the relationships of individuals and their understanding of themselves. I think it actually is that big. And in fact, if you realize that it's that big, then we have the means to engage people in understanding it. That's my view.
Thank you. Yeah, I share that view. And in fact, so much so that it almost flips around to be depressing, feeling like it's so big that how could I possibly capture it? But I think it is. Yeah.
We can't succeed without hope.
We've learned a lot, I think.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, we started something, and that's really brilliant. And I'm really looking forward to it, Gary. I think this will mesh with what we're doing. That connection to consciousness is actually very important to some of the other things that are going on.
Yes, agree.
So we'll see. Speak again. I'm looking forward to it. Anybody who could summarize what we've said already would be brilliant, first of all. But secondly, it may be helpful.
Okay. Thanks, everyone. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Bye.
Bye.